Within the scientific community, it is no surprise that the PhD experience is often a main focus. However, after graduating with the PhD, many scientists become postdoctoral researchers or postdocs. In today's episode, we're delving into this often underappreciated realm of postdoc positions, especially within the field of physics. These pivotal roles, often seen as the stepping stones between doctoral studies and full-fledged academic or industry positions, play a crucial role in shaping the future of science. They offer a unique space for budding scientists to refine their skills, collaborate on groundbreaking research, and contribute to the rapidly evolving landscape of physical science. To tell this story, I will be interviewing the two co-chairs of JILA's newly created postdoc group, a smaller community within JILA offering resources, training, and networking for the Institute's postdocs. The chairs, Jake Higgins, who uses they/them pronouns, and Rachel Merritt, who uses she/her pronouns, highlight the need for postdoc-focused communities in research, and why, surprisingly, the postdoc position may be the best time to switch fields for a researcher. So whether you're a seasoned physicist, a budding researcher, or just someone curious about the behind-the-scenes dynamics of the scientific community, stay with us as we unravel the significance of postdoctoral positions in physics. You're listening to Humans of JILA, a JILA podcast focusing on the human narrative of the institution's researchers. I'm your host and science communicator, Kenna Hughes Castleberry. Every month, I tell the story of a researcher or group within JILA, showcasing the human sides behind the science. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like it on our YouTube channel and follow us on Spotify. And be sure to share it with your friends and family. This episode features an interview with Rachel Merritt and Jake Higgins, two postdocs within JILA, who I am proud to say are very good friends of mine. Both lead the recently created postdoctoral group and will share their experiences and insights into what being a postdoc is really like. Let's begin our story. Because each postdoctoral position runs from 1 to 3 years, postdocs only have a small window of time to complete a full research project, though some may continue their research in a later faculty position. Because of this unique situation, every postdoc has to custom craft their projects to properly fit into that small time frame. As Rachel and Jake will tell you, this allows for some rather creative ideas.
Yeah, so I did my PhD in the world of ultrafast spectroscopy and biophysics in a chemistry department. Now, as a postdoc, I'm working in Jun Yi's lab on his frequency comb teams, trying to basically branch frequency comb technology into the ultraviolet regime. So what frequency combs are is really, what's a good way to explain this?
I'm going to be very impressed if you can explain this in like a very simple way.
Frequency combs are a technology that enable you to do really high-resolution spectroscopy experiments. And so what we're after in our team is actually this low-lying nuclear transition of this atom thorium-229, so it turns out, for whatever sort of nuclear physics reasons, that there's this one atom of all of the different types of atoms in the universe called thorium-229, which has a nuclear transition which exists somewhere in the ultraviolet region at about 150 nanometers. That is about 4 or 5 orders of magnitude lower than the vast majority of other nuclear transitions of all the other atoms in the universe. And it's not really clear why, but what we're trying to do with our frequency combs is actually search for that nuclear transition energy and basically narrow down that energy to really high precision so that it can be used for making a clock. So in our group, we specialize in optical atomic clocks as well as a lot of other things, which I don't really work on. But for a variety of reasons, a nuclear transition has been proposed to be a pretty damn good clock for about 10, 20, 30 years down the line. And so that's what we're searching for right now, is this nuclear transition. And it's been quite different. It really is a whole different world. The sort of day-to-day technologies, there's some stuff that I absolutely am completely fluent and comfortable in and have been dealing with for 7 years, and other day-to-day things that I just am still absolutely a novice. So it's definitely weird to on the one hand be an expert and on the other hand be just like a dumbass. But I'm swearing more now.
Good.
Yeah, and it's also kind of wild. I mean, I 2-3 years ago I was collaborating with a somewhat eminent biologist who is a big name in the photosynthesis world. And now I'm over here talking with nuclear physicists and trying to make sense of their language as well. So it's been quite a change. But for me, the sort of unifying theme of all of the work is the laser physics and the ultra-fast sort of spectroscopy apparatus that one could use to connect to all of these sort of seemingly random and disparate fields.
You.
Next. So I am working in Heather Lewandowski's Physics Education Research Group, and the project that I am working on right now is developing a framework for course-based undergraduate research experiences, or CURES, in physics. Because there's a lot of literature that shows that when students participate in undergraduate research, they have a lot of positive benefits that come out of this. They develop science identity, they develop a sense of belonging. This helps with recruitment and retention, and this is all wonderful. However, there are two kind of big problems with undergraduate research. The first is just supply and demand, right? There are only so many faculty with so many positions, and anecdotally, with the program that I ran when I was in grad school, we had 6 spots and we had 204 students apply for them. And so, you can't tell me that out of all the 198 other students who were applying, that they also weren't as deserving of this experience as those other people were. Also, there are systemic issues that keep students from participating in undergraduate research. And this could, range from not seeing yourself in science, or being a first-generation student who just doesn't know how to navigate this and doesn't know how to go and find somebody to do research with. Also, particularly for summer programs, students are typically expected to leave home for 10 weeks out of the year, and that just really isn't something that is possible for everybody. I think about myself when I was an undergrad. I worked a full-time job. So if what I was doing wasn't happening during the time I had scheduled classes, it wasn't happening. And so if you think of all of the positive benefits that come from undergraduate research, and you take that and you put it in a class, that lowers those barriers to participating. And so these cures exist a lot in biology and chemistry, but physics is identified as one of the fields that could benefit from having more of them. And we actually had a really successful version of this during the pandemic in the Physics 1140 class. And so our hope is that we are going to be able to revamp the Physics 2150 course into a cure, and during that process come up with this framework that we'll be able to share with universities across the country and make these experiences happen in other universities and really lower that barrier for students to participate in research.
Because postdocs like Rachel and Jake are not really considered university students, it can be difficult for these researchers to find a community or a sense of belonging at the institute they work at. Thankfully for the postdocs at both Gila and the University of Colorado Boulder, there are a lot of good resources.
And so CU is actually a really good university for postdocs because they actually have like an Office of Postdoctoral Affairs, and there is they have regular meetings, monthly meetings, where they have coffee on either the main campus or East Campus. And so there are a lot of resources that are provided that way. And so that's really, really nice. But I think that there's also benefit to having a GILA-specific postdoc group, because like with those events, you run into those people once a month when you go to the coffee hours, or like this week is actually Postdoc Appreciation Week. And so they had a week full of events. But for the GILA postdocs, we can run into each other in the hallways every day or get regular coffees. We're like, hey, I want to go to lunch, so I'm going to go 2 doors down and ask somebody if they want to go to lunch, instead of potentially having to go across campus to find somebody. And also just having an understanding of what happens in GILA. And I feel like that's kind of the same thing for any department or group, where there are specific things to the place that you are housed. And so while it's nice to have that broader community, I think it's also important to have that community that is specific to where you are located.
As the postdoctoral position is rather flexible in timing and focus, it attracts individuals from all sorts of backgrounds, as you'll hear from both Jake and Rachel.
Yeah, so I think my PhD is in astronomy. And I think like most people who do astronomy, there's some sort of event that happens in their youth that encourages them to pursue that. And for me, it was when I was either 5 or 6, I don't remember exactly, but there was a solar eclipse and my dad took us outside with a welding mask and let us look at the eclipse. And I just remember looking at that and thinking, I want to do that. because it was something that I knew logically was so far away, but I was able to see a phenomenon happening there. And it was just something that really piqued my interest and then stuck with me.
That's awesome. And then obviously since then you got your PhD in astronomy. We'll kind of talk a little bit about your transition from astronomy to VR.
So, starting with that initial viewing of the sun, I guess I expect nothing less of myself than liking extreme things. And so I transitioned from liking stars to liking some of the most extreme objects in the universe. My master's research focused on crustal cooling of neutron stars. So when you have a neutron star that has a companion, the systems that I studied are called low-mass X-ray binaries. So basically you have a neutron star and a sun-like star. And neutron stars are stellar remnants, so it is a dead star. And like all good zombies, if they have a companion too close, they'll start cannibalizing them. And so these systems go through periods of outburst and quiescence, so periods where they're actively accreting material from the companion star, and then once its accretion disk fills up, stops accreting, and then will cool off. And so if you didn't know this, neutron stars are actually the only star that actually has a solid surface. So they have a solid crust with little mountains that are like a few millimeters tall. But because the gravity is so intense, you wouldn't actually have enough energy in your entire life to step up on one of those tiny little mountains. But we are able to use X-ray observations to observe this periods of outburst and quiescence. And then you can use modeling codes to try to constrain parameters about the neutron star, specifically mass and diameter.
Wow.
And then when I started my PhD, neutron stars are awesome, but we have to go one step bigger, and I studied supermassive black holes, so that are actively eating in the center of galaxies.
That is fascinating, and I have so many more questions I want to ask you, but I don't want to get too off topic, so I will refrain and ask you at a different time. So Jake, same question. What motivated you to have a career in physics?
So when I was in high school, I had a couple of really good teachers, one of whom was actually a biology teacher, and the other of whom was actually a calculus teacher. So I was kind of pulled in these two different directions of one of like these sort of really quantitative types of questions and other these types of large-scale biological type questions. And so I grew up in a small town, so I didn't really know about research or the fact that people could just be researchers. But it only took me about a semester after I went to college to kind of figure out that this is something that I wanted to do. I saw all these professors and I was like, oh, you can just be somebody who asks questions and is curious and can answer whatever you want to answer, I guess. So like I said, I had a good biology teacher, so I started off in the sort of biological sphere. And then slowly but surely over college, I sort of drifted into the sort of more physical sciences. And my major ended up being chemical physics. And that's kind of where I am now, is ever since then I've kind of been straddling this line of chemistry and physics, where I don't know which way I would classify myself, if I'm more of a chemist or a physicist, but I definitely like both, and I like being at that intersection, I think, because if you're a chemical physicist, you are perched in a place where you look below you and you have all these fundamental laws of physics, laws of quantum mechanics and thermodynamics and statistical mechanics, and if you look above, you have the vast, incredible complexity of the world and of chemical systems and of biochemical systems. And I really like being kind of perched here where you can basically sit here and pull up from below and answer questions above, I guess. So trying to find really, really fundamental properties of, say, biological proteins and try to basically map those onto like really simple to understand physical properties and physical observables is a really interesting place for me. So I actually did my PhD in a chemistry department studying pigment protein complexes and doing ultra-fast spectroscopy on those pigment protein complexes. Specifically, I studied photosynthetic organisms and how photosynthetic complexes are able to capture solar energy and then transport that solar energy through space in the form of molecular excitons. So it's actually remarkable. I'm obsessed with photoenzymes and still think about them every day, even though I'm in a totally different thing now. But turns out proteins are incredibly good at manipulating the excited state dynamics of molecules. So they can transport excitations across pretty big distances of space on the molecular scale with really high fidelity and really high efficiency. And so my work in my PhD was to try to uncover the sort of quantum mechanical mechanisms by which that happened. So how does this protein environment craft a very specific type of environment for these small molecules to maximize energy transfer efficiency, and what are the knobs that the proteins tune. So is it purely electromagnetic, where you engineer electromagnetic couplings, or do you have a bunch of other weird vibronic stuff that comes into play? Is there, non-adiabatic couplings in the excited state, which would, I guess I'm leaning into buzzwords, but basically what are the knobs that these proteins are tuning in order to enhance this energy transport? And the idea here is to, study certain pigment protein complexes to death and try to extrapolate generalizable principles that you could yourself engineer in the lab, I guess. So that was my PhD work, and I'm over here in the physics world now, trying my intention at first was to try to basically make this switch into this field and learn the technologies and the questions in the AMO world. I'm currently in Jun Yi's lab, and see if I can apply them to some of the questions I had in the chemistry world. And then maybe fall in love with some AMO questions along the way, and I'm open to that. And that's sort of my motivation.
That. As a person who studied botany, I have a lot of questions for you too, because that is amazing, and I'm just like nerding out over here, I love this. I want to chat more about this with you too. But yes, again, time, and I want to keep us on topic. So my next question for you is describing your research journeys, how you came to JILA, how you became a postdoc. Now that I think about it, both of you have kind of switched fields a little bit, right? I mean, you from chemical physics into AMO, you from astrophysics to PER. Can we talk a little bit about what that switch was like, and again, how you became a postdoc here at JILA?
I can go first this time?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Yeah, so like I was just saying, is I have my PhD in chemistry, and there's all sorts of questions about excited state chemistry that I think remain elusive to a lot of chemists that we don't have very good experimental access to. So I wanted to come over to a place like JILA, which is kind of known for its expertise in instrumentation, and it's a very good place for AMO, where they've obviously JILA has been the pioneer in a ton of different AMO areas, and I wanted to see if either one, the technologies from the AMO world could be applied to the chemistry world, or if the actual AMO systems can be used to answer sort of bigger scale questions that are maybe more related to chemistry. This is a big thing in AMO physics with quantum simulation and trying to understand a lot of questions in condensed matter physics. So the same idea can possibly be applied to some more chemistry flavored questions. And so I guess what that was like at the beginning was culture shock.
Yeah.
It was pretty crazy for a while there. I mean, in some sense, I felt like a first-year grad student again. Everything was confusing, and there was a very massive language barrier. One thing I have slowly figured out over the last year and a half is that oftentimes me and an AMO physicist can be talking about the same thing, but in a very different context, coming from a different place, and using different technical language. And if we're not careful, and if we're not actively paying attention to each other, then it's very easy for us to talk past one another and not be able to sort of connect scientifically. So yeah, and a lot of base level assumptions about the systems we're working with. I'm still piecing together the way that AMO physicists think about their problems and their questions, and how it's different from the way that I did as a physical chemist. So AMO is so cold. It's ultra cold atoms and ultra cold molecules. But everything I worked with was, by their standards, extremely hot. So I actually thought about heat, and it was very much like the statistical mechanics of temperature was ingrained into my thinking. It was often confusing for both of us, for all people involved, when I would try to talk about some sort of atomic or molecular system. Yeah, that was a big change, but it's been really interesting. My PhD advisor from the very beginning was basically telling us to change fields at a postdoc, because I see this now because it stretches your mind out in a certain way, and even though you have a PhD and a specialization in one field, you still are a little bit siloed, or a little bit, it's hard to, you've been thinking up and down the same lines for so many years, the same intellectual strands. It's kind of hard to see horizontally, I guess. Doing something like this has been very broadening in my perspective of atoms and molecules and lasers and all of that.
And yeah, I was actually going to ask you guys, why is a postdoc a good time to change fields? But it sounds like you just answered that as far as expanding your knowledge and being more multidisciplinary.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. How about you, Rachel?
Yeah, so I again, my PhD was in astronomy, so I was doing my astronomy research, and then COVID happened, and
as always,
which disrupted a lot of things for a lot of people. Luckily, I did my prospectus like 2 months before lockdown happened, so if it had to happen during my PhD, at least it happened, I guess, at the scare quotes right time. And because of just the absolute upheaval, myself and another graduate student, we ended up redoing all of the introductory astronomy labs so that they could be done online when we were doing online teaching. And during that time, thinking about, things that I had never thought about why this particular lab manual maybe wasn't the best lab manual. And then in addition to that, when we were actually teaching the students, having the students come to our office hours, our virtual office hours over Zoom, and hearing how much they were struggling and talking to faculty and hearing how much they were struggling really made me think, oh my gosh, I'm helping my immediate sphere, but there is a much bigger sphere of people that if I was doing something else, I could be helping them. And so with this existential crisis in my brain, I went and talked to my PhD advisor, and she was amazing about it. And she was like, cool, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, I either want to do education research or I want to do science policy. She was like, perfect. So she was really great about connecting me with people so I could, because, she is an astronomer, she doesn't do that kind of stuff, but connecting me with people so that I could explore my options. And then in the fall, before I was ready to graduate, I was planning on graduating at the end of the summer of 2022. And so in the fall of 2021, I started looking at jobs and I saw the position here. And I was like, well, it looks like they're looking for somebody to start immediately, which I am not going to be capable of doing. But, this might be a really good opportunity for me to just see if my application even gets a nibble. Am I competitive in any way that I could pursue this potentially? So I submitted my application and ended up getting a job offer.
That's the way you wanted to
right?
go.
And I was like, oh, okay, we're doing this now. And so I defended in May of 2022 and then started in June of 2022. So I had 3 weeks in between my defense and when I started. And kind of going off of what Jake said, it definitely is that feeling of being a first-year graduate student again. Yeah. The difference is that you've spent the last 5 years knowing how to be a graduate student. Yeah. So it doesn't feel quite as daunting as it did the first time around. Yeah. Yeah. And so for me, it is, learning a bunch of different and new methods that I didn't do in my, astronomical research, but also being surprised about some of the computational methods that I was actually able to carry over into my PER research. Yeah, carrying over, and also the fact that, Heather has been really supportive and is actually, it's pretty common for her to hire switchers, so she knows how to handle us and help us kind of adjust into that. And because out of the 4 postdocs, myself included in the group, 3 of us are switchers. And so I had 2 other people who had been in exactly the same spot as me. And so it was really nice to have people who, when you have those moments of oh my gosh, what is happening? This is new and I don't know what to do. They all were in those spots and could kind of talk you down from that. And just, it's been for me, where I think in a lot of places PER is kind of peripheral. At CU and in GILA, it is not. We have a very, I don't know if dominant is the right word.
Dominant, robust.
But powerful, present, established PER group here. And realizing and seeing that reception within GILA has been awesome and something that I have been very thankful for.
I know we could go on about PER and how people view it. And yes, I'm in the same boat as you where I want it to be established everywhere. Mm-hmm. But we won't because, again, we're going off topic. So what is it like being a postdoc as opposed to a graduate student? And then maybe what are some things that people don't really understand about being a postdoc, or what are some things that maybe they should know, whether they're thinking about becoming one or just kind of the general consensus of what people think of?
Yeah, actually, kind of like what Rachel was saying is that being a postdoc is kind of like being a grad student again, but it's more pressure and the timeline is shorter. Yeah. But at least you have, like you were saying, the experience of having done it before. And it's just that's something I forgot to mention earlier, is that I have this mountain of new information to learn, but I kind of know how to navigate it a little bit better than I did the first time. When I was a grad student, I just sort of floundered up the hill and didn't know exactly which direction I was going. And now it feels like as a postdoc, you might be a little bit more directed in that because you have that experience. But I don't know, being a postdoc is kind of stressful. It's hard because, like I said, you're grad student 2.0, you're working in the lab all the time, but you're also supposed to be thinking, about a lot of your big picture career questions. So,
what happens next?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
I'm supposed to be reading the literature, emphasis on supposed to be. I should be reading the literature and formulating my independent research ideas and networking and all of that stuff. So I feel like kind of pulled in a lot of different directions, and it's a little hard to know if I'm doing it right. Sometimes I feel like I'm spending too much in the lab and not thinking about my career enough, and sometimes I think I'm not spending enough time in the lab, and so there's not a great way to do it right, it feels, at least.
Yeah, and I guess maybe using like a bicycle analogy, I feel like when you're a grad student, it's like having regular training wheels where like you have your 2 bike wheels on the ground and then you have your training wheels very firmly on the ground. And being a postdoc is like you still have the training wheels, but they've been lifted up. So they really only catch you like if you tip over a little bit. And so like while we're learning to be independent researchers, we still have a supervisor here who can kind of like, the raised up training wheels that catch us so we don't completely fall over on our bicycle. And yeah, just trying to find ways to become well-rounded, I think, is one of the biggest struggles for me. And not because I don't have opportunities to do so, or not because Heather and I haven't had tons of conversations about this, but just kind of knowing what it is that you want to do and how to carry forward with that. Because, when you're in grad school, you have the one thing that is writing the dissertation. That is the goal. That is the plan. That is everything. And as a postdoc, it's like, well, a job is kind of that. Job is much more nebulous than dissertation. And so it's like, well, what kind of job? Do I want a faculty job? Do I want an industry job? Do I want an academia adjacent job? And that there are just so many options that it can sometimes be overwhelming. And it's like, well, what steps should I be doing, to become an independent researcher when I don't know what form that final researcher will take? Mm-hmm. So that can be a little stressful at times.
One thing I like being a postdoc and maybe being a senior grad student is that, I don't know how to say this, but I kind of feel like in some sense like I'm a baby scientist or
baby scientist
or maybe toddler scientist. I don't know. Well, an analogy with your bicycle analogy, the training wheels are.
So now we have a baby scientist on a bicycle. Yeah, is what you're telling me.
Perfect.
Okay,
with training wheels.
I like this.
Like there's one point in my PhD where my advisor said to me, it was kind of toward the end of my PhD, I had put out my big paper, and he said, you're probably sitting in a position where you have a mountain of ideas right now, and about half of them are good and half of them are bad. And it's, welcome to the process, right? And it's kind of fun to, kind of share ideas that I think are original. And of course, a lot of them are naive and dumb and can be shredded apart. But that process is kind of exciting, of being able to do that. And having more ideas than I have time to do with is, stressful place, but a fun place to be.
Yeah. So kind of to follow up on that, as far as like maybe giving advice for graduate students who are considering a postdoc, it sounds like perhaps keep your ideas with you and carry them forward, continue to think about what you want to be as a researcher.
Yeah. Well, and I think also something that in grad school, I ran our internal undergraduate research program in the summer. And one of the things I would always tell the students at like the beginning of the summer was like, you may not like your research project. And at the end of the 10 weeks, you may decide that this is not for you. And you know what? This isn't heaven. You're not stuck here forever. I feel like that's kind of something similar with a postdoc, right? Like the skills, even if you're like, this research isn't necessarily what I want. And, I talk about the nebulousness of jobs. Even with that nebulousness, the skills that we're being taught now and that we're sharpening now are going to serve us regardless of what we do going forward. And so, if you do a, 2 to 3 year postdoc, which is pretty normal for a postdoc, at the end of those 2 to 3 years, you have the freedom to make a decision about what you do next. Again, not heaven, not stuck here forever. And so I think that it is I think a postdoc is a really good place to, explore your interests in a positive way, where, you come in, you do the work, and then where you go after that, doesn't take away from the experience that you had as a postdoc, regardless of what you do after that.
I like that you basically analogized a research lab with heaven.
I think usually people do the other one, right?
It's at least purgatory, like 50% of the time.
Maybe some limbo, maybe some hell, depending on your project.
Yeah, but that's great. I like you to go in your lab.
This makes me feel better inside. And a lot of people too.
Yeah. Another thing I would say, and this is meant to amplify exactly what Rachel's been saying, is to try to a graduate student, I would say to try to round yourself out as much as you can. I mean, it's hard because if you're an experimental laser physicist or anything like that, you're spending a lot of time in the basement in a windowless room, like playing with finicky lasers. It's easy to fall into only specialization, but Rachel and I can probably both speak to this because we both were really involved with other stuff in graduate school. Like when I was in graduate school, I was really involved with like a student activist organization, and I actually did spend a good amount of my time and efforts running that organization and like making it tick, I guess. And that actually, one, it made me a lot more sane than I would have otherwise been. But two, it developed a lot of these, I don't know, I think they call them soft skills, which is kind of a dumb phrase, but it helped you develop, interpersonal skills and organization and how to herd a group of people who are more like cats than people, and how to actually get stuff done, I think. And it's a good way to expand your mind again and to expand your own skill set.
Well, and you also never know when those opportunities are going to end up being of benefit to you. So I recently was awarded an NSF MPS Ascend postdoctoral fellowship. And in my reviews back, the fact that I had run this undergraduate research program was one of the things that was listed as like a strength for myself as the PI for the research program that I'm working on for my fellowship. And, that the fact that was something that made me happy in the moment while I was doing it, and then also was of benefit to my career. So, life is entirely too short to be unhappy. So make sure that you're like putting those things into your life that bring you joy.
That actually kind of segues into my next question, which is talking about extracurricular activity. I don't want to say extracurricular. That's not the right word.
Activities outside of lab or something?
Outside lab activities. We'll go with that. I like that better. Or just like outside of normal research, your research focus or something. But one of the things you both do is run the postdoc group here at Gilla. And that's something that, you both have shared with me off mic and separately, that it's just been a really good opportunity for leadership and seeing the other postdocs kind of come into this community. So I was hoping that you could explain what the postdoc group was, how it supports the community of postdocs here at Gilla, and kind of how the process came about of leading it and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that is pretty common knowledge and kind of universally agreed upon as postdocs is it's kind of lonely, because you don't, unlike in grad school, you don't come in with a cohort. And also your time is limited. I mean, some postdocs are as short as 1 year. Like if you get a 3-year postdoc, you're doing pretty good for yourself. But, even during that time, you spend the first year getting settled, and then you spend the second year doing your science, and then you spend the third year applying for jobs. And so it is like just a lot of stuff pushed down into a very limited amount of time. And because of that, it can be very isolating. And I don't know if my academic upbringing was strange, but when I was an undergraduate student at Wayne State in Detroit, and then when I was a graduate student at Georgia State, I was very integrated into the department. And so when I came to Gilla, I was like, oh, well, I want to also be integrated into Gilla. I want people to know who I am. I want to know who people are. And so that was one of the reasons that I wanted to get involved with the postdoc group, which didn't actually exist. So
yeah, you guys kind of co-founded it a little bit.
I had been talking with you and some of the other staff at Gilla, and it seems like Jake was doing the same.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then it was like, you two should meet. And it's been great ever since.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and similar to that question I had earlier about, am I doing my postdoc right? I think one thing that is also kind of common for postdocs is to not have any sort of specific career development thing specifically for postdocs. I mean, oftentimes it's just you and your advisor talking about the future. And while that can be extremely helpful, it's nice to have a sort of broader perspective on that. And so, I think it's helpful to have spaces that are specifically dedicated toward professional development of postdocs. So my question is like, how much of my energy should I be thinking about an independent faculty proposal versus working in the lab? And how do I do that? How do I sort of cultivate that independence over the course of my postdoc is a question that I had. And so one of the events that Rachel and I organized, along with a bunch of other really helpful JILA staff, was this building a faculty proposal panel where we had a bunch of JILA fellows and one other JILA staff member talk about what that process was like for them, and sort of disseminate advice about what they've seen that makes a good faculty proposal and what doesn't make a good faculty proposal, and what the interview process is like, and what are the common things that people run into whenever they are applying. So I think having that space specifically for professional development is really helpful, but exactly like what Rachel was saying is also community, because postdocs, it can be kind of a weird, tenuous timeline or time in your in the process where it feels kind of transient, but it's also 3 years long. So you still are a human being and you still need to be in community with other people. It's hard to do that when I'm just in the lab all the time and I only really see the other postdocs and graduate students that are across the hall. So we wanted a dedicated space for that, both for community and wellness, which are obviously extremely important, but also something I like to mention is that it helps you out scientifically as well. I mean, I didn't say this earlier, but one of my huge benefits from working a quote-unquote extracurricular in grad school or in my activist community is I interfaced with a ton of different scientists from all other disciplines. It was like very cross-departmental. And I would always like chit-chat with them about science. And like one of the, some of my friends would go and show me their mouse room. They had a whole floor dedicated to mice. I was like, this is a wildly different world than the one I live in. And you can ask questions about like why they're interested in those questions. And like, I think that's something that is incredibly helpful as a scientist, is to actually understand what other people are doing and try to listen to them on their own terms of what their scientific questions are. So.
Or you can be awkward like me, and when you're trying to bond with the AMO people when they're talking about their lasers, tell them that you lasered the moon once.
Yeah, you gotta relate, right? That's right.
I feel like you just have the one joke that you just slip into every conversation. You're like, hopefully they get it.
Well, no, I literally lasered the moon once.
I think that's fantastic. How do they respond usually when you
I mean, it usually ends up with a lot of silence and blank stares, but...
I think I was there.
Yeah.
I was more like, cool. I've never done that.
Because I feel like that's one of those things you can't really tell if somebody's joking or not.
Oh, it's
like,
true.
Did you actually laser the moon? I did. But you don't know if you're like, oh, you were an astronomer. That makes a lot more sense. Like,
right, as opposed to
that.
no context. I lasered the moon.
Yeah.
Cool. What does that mean? Yeah.
No, and I think that, like Jake was saying, in addition to the community and the professional development, putting those things together and just becoming well-rounded individuals professionally. Because, I know that a lot of science is like these lone geniuses, but that's really not the reality of any of this. And, even if you leave academia and go into an industry or other position, you're constantly going to be working with people. And so being able to do excellent research as well as work in a group and competently and capably, is that even a word?
Capably?
Capably? Okay, yay. Communicate your science results matters. And so being able to have the opportunity to continue to hone those skills, I think is really important for postdocs, because we want to go out into the world and have people be like, oh, you came from JILA? We love the people from JILA.
Right. Or, you got your postdoc. You're really smart. I'm going to hire you or something, right?
Yeah. You are a completely well-rounded individual, a great researcher, capable of all the project management stuff, communication, overseeing graduate students, undergraduate students, other employees. All of those things are going to be benefit, right? Regardless of what you do after you leave JILA.
Yeah, absolutely. So you both kind of touched on it a little bit, but I'll ask, I don't see, at least in my own research, very many institutions that have a postdoc group specifically. So, what are some of the benefits? And again, we already touched on this a little bit, but what are some of the benefits of having a dedicated installed postdoc group into maybe an institution?
I think kind of building off of what Jake said is, we are a scientific institute, right? That is the point of here. And being able to meet people outside of your lab and building those relationships. This is something that the chair of my department when I was a graduate student would always say. He was like, Rachel, we're old. If you end up working with us, it'll only be for a little while. It's the people that are your colleagues right now, like your peers right now who will be your colleagues going forward. And I think that's kind of similar here. Like the people who are working in the labs next door are the people who will be our colleagues going forward, and starting to facilitate those relationships early in your career that can carry you through the remainder of your career, I think is really important. And because so many of the research groups here at JILA are lab groups, it is really easy to get, holed up in your windowless lab and not get out and meet anybody. And so I think that this is really an important thing to start allowing people to build those collaborations.
In addition to all of the things that we've said so far about community and professional development, I think having something that's institutionalized into JILA is actually quite important, because oftentimes, very often in these very unstructured scientific settings, you have people sort of quote unquote fall through the cracks, or not even fall through the cracks, but they aren't properly supported. And the people who that happens to very disproportionately falls along lines of gender, race, sexuality, ability status, first-gen status, all of these different axes. And it's oftentimes your ability to, sort of thrive in a certain setting can rely on your ability to assimilate into the sort of good old boys network, I guess, or into whatever sort of culture you have in that lab, which may or may not be welcoming to different kinds of people. And so I think there's been a lot of research showing in the last few years, a lot of EDI-based research, that having institutionalized structures in departments is one way to combat that, is having a structural entity within JILA that's specifically dedicated toward postdocs, which people can use, and people are still welcome to use their more ad hoc methods too. I think something like that is really important, and I think it can help combat some of these structural issues in STEM as well.
I think both those points are really important, right? Having something there that's kind of ingrained into the institution is the most important thing. Well, I know, Rachel, you touched on this before, and I am going to ask the question, but you do not have to answer if you don't want to, because you may not know, right? But my question is for both of you, kind of what are your next career steps? And if you don't know, again, that's totally fine. And how has JILA kind of helped you, or maybe prepared you, or kind of started you on the process, maybe even?
Yeah, so I am very, very interested in pursuing a faculty position. I also am a realist, and faculty positions are few and far between, and they can be very competitive with a lot of people applying for them. So while that will be my main goal, I also am keeping my periphery open to other opportunities that may come my way, which I think is just always something good to do. I have a meme hanging up on the bulletin board in my office of a cat in a parachute, and it's figure one, a well-prepared cat. And so that is kind of my goal when it comes to thinking about career steps, is have a main goal, but also be open to other things, because, if I wouldn't have been open to other things, I wouldn't be here right now. So, yeah. And I think that, I think Heather, who is my supervisor, has been a great resource, because we talk very regularly about what my goals are. And, she's really encouraging me to pursue leadership roles in outside organizations and things like that. So she's been really great about supporting me about that. And also with the postdoc group, this is also giving me an opportunity to start building relationships with other fellows in JILA. And so building up the amount of people that can give me advice or suggestions, I think, is something that is really helpful and that I've really appreciated.
Very similarly to Rachel, I am interested in pursuing a faculty position, but in the spirit of trying to be a well-prepared cat, I'm trying to reframe that as being about more the kind of questions I'm after. I have a set of questions in the back of my head that I'm kind of chewing on all the time, and I kind of want to reframe my own thing in my head about being what is the avenue that I can use to pursue those questions. So obviously an academic position would be one way to do that, but there's also industry jobs and there's government jobs and there's a lot of places where people can pursue independent scientific research outside of academia, and I think there are more today than there have been in the past, and so that's kind of what I'm trying to frame it as. How has Jilla been helping me toward these? Well, when I entered my postdoc, I kind of think I had a decent idea of like what I had good experience in and what I needed to develop. And one of those was like instrument building and really rigorous. When I was in grad school, I sort of inherited an instrument and tweaked it up and like optimized it and made it a couple steps better than when I started, but I never built anything. And, Jilla is a really good place if you want to build stuff. You have a lot of really brilliant people around. You have Jilla fellows, you have great graduate students and postdocs, you have amazing Jilla staff. And in some sense, that can be a really good way to delocalize your ignorance. So not anybody knows exactly what you don't understand. Everybody knows a little bit. But better way of saying that is to you have a lot of support and you have a lot of people that you can ask all of your dumb questions to. Jilla has been really helpful in that regard and me wanting to build some of those skills.
Thank you for listening to Humans of Jilla, a Jilla podcast. Be sure to subscribe to Jilla's YouTube channel or Spotify channel for more information and to keep listening to these episodes. This episode featured Jilla postdocs Rachel Merritt and Jake Higgins. Production design, sound design, and research by Kenna Hughes Castleberry, with the assistance of Jilla's Science Communication Office. Sound and music by Pixabay and Kevin MacLeod. Jilla is a joint institute between NIST and the University of Colorado Boulder. This podcast is hosted by Jilla. Any use of this podcast without Jilla's permission or credit is prohibited.